Thank you for joining us for Local News Roundtable, the final session of the news conference, Real and Powerful, the Fair Media Council's annual event. This year, we are proudly sponsored by Northwell Health, Henry Schein, Protiviti, St. Joseph's College, the Bartol Law Firm, and Hofstra University. This is Jackie Clement, Fair and Media Council CEO and Executive Director. This session is moderated by Chris Wright, Managing Director at Protiviti, and a member of the Fair Media Council's Board of Directors. Joining Chris is Long Island Business News reporter David Winzelberg, NBC New York reporter Pei-Sze Cheng, Newsday reporter Cecilia Dowd, and Terry Sheridan, News Director of WSHU Public Radio. We'll begin by letting the panelists tell you a little bit about themselves. Let's begin with Pei-Sze.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Pei-Sze Cheng, and I'm a reporter at WNBC. I'm with the investigative unit as well, but for the past 2 years since COVID started, I've been, no one's really been back at the office, and we've been covering various regions and different stories. So I've actually had the opportunity to report on many different topics and issues, and just some of the work that I've done this year include covering the Gabby Petito, the search for Gabby Petito and the search for Brian Laundrie after that. So we've been following that case, and just whatever issues are popping up in the tri-state area. But I've been at WNBC since 2005. So I think it's, 17 years. So I've pretty much covered every topic, every news story that has happened here in that past 17 years. So anyways, that's it.
And maybe David.
Yep, I'm David Winselberg. I write for the Long Island Business News. I've been there almost 15 years, since 2007. And I write mostly about real estate, land use development, retailing, franchising, small business, that sort of thing. And that's it.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Hey everyone, I work for Newsday. I am sort of an anomaly there because I am not a print reporter, as I call them. I'm a TV reporter. Newsday was building this big TV studio. It's called Newsday TV, and then of course COVID hit, so things got a little strange. But we are planning a newscast. So I do on-air stories for Newsday.com. And prior to that, I was a TV reporter for FiOS, One News, which shut down. And I spent a decade as an assignment editor at News 12 Long Island. So I've kind of done it all in the news business. And a little bit similar to Pei-Sze, I kind of cover, well, I'm not an investigative, but I cover, tend to cover like the big stories of the day. I've done Petito, I've done politics, I've done court. So it's sort of, it's kind of cool waking up every morning. You never know what you're going to do. So.
Great. And Terry.
Yeah, I'm Terry Sheridan. I'm the news director at WSHU Public Radio. We are based out of Fairfield, Connecticut, but a third of our audience is on Long Island, and we are the most listened to public radio station on Long Island. So we are also have our Long Island Bureau at Stony Brook University. We are embedded in the School of Communications and Journalism at Stony Brook. I've been with WSHU since 2016. Before that, I was a longtime radio reporter in New York City for both 1010 Winds and WOR. And I also flew traffic patrol for WCBS.
And as a result, you have a very familiar voice, but perhaps are a new face to many, which is good.
Well, yes, thank God.
Which is good. So I'm Chris Wright. I'll be moderating. I'm a member of the Fair Media Council board. I'm a CPA, a managing director with Protiviti Consulting, and I'm a consumer of the news, but sometimes an object of it from my volunteer world, where I'm a member of the Nassau County Interim Finance Authority Board. And while it wouldn't ordinarily be news, every now and again, I'm also the treasurer of the trustees of the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island, which is Brooklyn, Queens, Nassau, and Suffolk. And we occasionally have some property type news, and so I'll actually have a question for David, perhaps, or others, or when we get to how do you determine if someone's a reliable source. So the today's panel, and thank you all for joining, the panelists as well as those who are attending and viewing and taking part, was billed to be a chat about what it is that you all look for in a story, what stories you prefer to be involved with, how you determine if somebody's a reliable source, and what you're working on now. So why don't we start with an easy one, which is, if you can say, and Pei-Sze, because you do investigative reporting, maybe you can't. I should add that Long Island has given you a scandal every now and again, which is good, right? So we
I
try
know
not,
it's actually
can't
been
schedule
very
those.
productive.
Right, we can't schedule those, but they do come with some regularity. But maybe Pei-Sze, if you could start, and what you're working on now, where are you focused, and not necessarily where you're sitting today, but unless that's part of it, but what you're working on now.
Yeah, it's funny, actually. I joke all the time because I've been doing a series of podcasts when I was doing a series of podcasts covering the Gabby Petito story, but every interview was done in my car because we haven't been back in the office for so long. And I'm always on the road covering stories. So one of the comments is always, why is this woman always in her car? So anyways, it's fitting that I'm doing this panel from my car because I'm here because we're doing a storm coverage today. So today's a storm coverage day. What are the stories I'm working on? I'm working on a story involving the MTA police. I can't say anything more, but beyond that, I'm working on, let's see, there's something involving education and how education deals with special needs students. So there's a wide range of issues that we end up covering, but ultimately what I find to be a very interesting story is, something with a good character. A story with a good character is always very good because you can anchor your story around that. You can anchor any issue around a really good character and a reason why people need to care about this topic. And if there's video, I have to say, I just recently covered a story about a mother on Long Island who was arrested for giving her son's friend a shot of the COVID vaccine in her house. She's not a medical professional. She's not a doctor. We don't know how she got the vaccine, but I'm telling you, this story would not have taken off like it did, if there wasn't video of it. So that's always an aspect of, a story. If people are trying to pitch me something, if there are pictures or video, it's almost always easier to sell the story.
So that's, in other words, source provided video, not video you gather in the field, but that sort of prompts the story with all the various devices that are around.
Yeah, I mean, you can gather it yourself as well. It's just harder, but if a source has the video or some type of media to help push the story along, it makes it a lot easier to sell.
Interesting. A friend of mine who lives a few blocks from here, where a tornado touched down a few months ago, had every news organization knocking on his door for his Ring camera.
Yeah.
They all wanted the
Where do
video.
you live? What was that? Bayshore? No, where was
Levittown.
that?
Levittown.
Levittown. Yeah. Oh, is that your friend?
Yeah.
It might have been me. I did ask.
Oh, okay, you might have been one of
the
them.
video.
But the video was what made people realize what happened where, right? And it came from an odd source, the doorbell.
It makes it so interesting, and everybody's got a Ring doorbell now, so it's like the first thing we look for when we go out. The recent fire in the Bronx, not the super fatal one with like 17 people died, but Terry, you remember this one, right? The one in what is it called? Kingsbridge? No, Dunwoody, I think, right? It was up in the Bronx. It was a 2-story building. They had video of it. There was like a Ring door security video of how this thing, went up in smoke so quickly. Like that really tells us a lot about it. So anyways, video elements for like TV or web really help sell the story.
And you're monitoring social media for that independently, or so it's a multiple channels, right? What comes to you?
It's multi-pronged. Yeah. I mean, you seek it yourself, you go and look for it, but you also can look on social media for it. Mm-hmm.
So David, you told us a little bit about what you ordinarily work on. Maybe is there anything in particular regarding real estate, land use, retail, or that you're working on now that's developing?
Well, I'm always working on stories about new development projects and also just the market itself. I cover both commercial real estate and residential real estate. So I'm always talking about the market. We're a business to business paper. So my audience and my readers are very interested in deals, individual deals that may not be a story for other outlets, but it's always a very big story for us because people want to find out who's buying what, who's selling what. It's what we call actionable business intelligence because it's something they could make money with. So my audience are brokers, landowners, that type of thing. So they're always very, very interested in how much something's selling for, who's selling it, that type of thing. So that's always very, very big in my world.
Thank you. In fact, on the earlier panel, Pam from Huntington Now was talking about what would ordinarily be considered a greater good, sewers in a particular area, because they're good for the environment, but it allows greater population density. So it might actually be how a big housing development that's been fought over for 40 years finally comes in. But then there's a business impact because it could create larger stores who could push out the mom and pops, right? So it was as if there was a lot of things converging around what would be a simple story of we're putting sewers in Huntington Station.
Yeah, I mean, some communities have rejected sewers, Rocky Point being one, because they were fearing overdevelopment. But, as you said, sewers are great for the environment, especially in Suffolk doesn't have, Nassau is mostly like 80% or more sewered. And Suffolk is just the opposite. It's very, very, very little of it is sewered. And it really does hold back a lot of things. You could have a restaurant with 50 seats or 40 seats, or you could have a restaurant with 120 seats, depending on the capacity for wastewater. So there's just so much, connected with sewers. And it does allow for more development, but it also is very, very good for the environment. It cuts down on nitrogen pollution.
Great, thank you. Cecilia, what are you working on right now? What's keeping you busy or got your interests currently, if you could say?
Well, I mean, today, like Pei-Sze, I'm doing snow. The governor's on Long Island at 1, so I'm going to race out after this and go to the governor and then go to Riverhead because the East End is supposed to be hit the hardest. They put me up in a hotel tonight, but I would love to do more like in-depth things. I tend to do more day of air, but like one story I pitched recently, which I'm hoping comes to fruition, has to do with a woman in desperate need of a kidney, and she put a call out there, and without getting into too many details, really unique story. But the problem like with my shifts, and I think others could understand this, is like, sometimes I really want to work on something and you're all set to go. And then you wake up the next morning and there was like a crazy breaking news story overnight. So it kind of, you will, I mean, Terry, you're nodding, like, it all gets put on hold. So I'm more of sort of like, I pitch a bunch of ideas, sometimes at night, sometimes early in the morning, but depending what happens up until 9 a.m., like something could happen at 7 a.m. and everything, changes. Like, for example, the other day with this mask confusion, right? Everyone was reading this judge's ruling differently, and whether or not there was a stay and whether or not kids had to wear masks in school, there were parents protesting. And I had wanted to do my kidney story that I believe it was that morning. And then all of a sudden, you see on social media, moms are gathering here and doing this. And then all of a sudden, everything changes. So I'm more of, I have worked on some in-depth stuff, but I kind of tend to be the breaking news of the day. So snow is the news of the day today.
It is, yeah. I'm headed to the North Fork later tonight too, hopefully to wake up and be more helpful out there than I, while my neighbors handle things here. But maybe I'll see you on the Long Island Expressway.
Yeah.
Get off the exit before the last exit, take Route 24 through the circle. It's quicker.
Okay.
Yeah. So little secret. And it's interesting you mentioned the schools, right? On the last panel, school district elections, which could normally be relatively not breaking news, what's your increase? Half the time there aren't even more than one candidate. Might be a lot more dynamic this year because of the various interest groups that are advocating for things that may have nothing to do with education, but they're decided by the school board, right? So the story, I don't think there's going to be any book banning stories like there were I forget what state it was this morning. I personally actually was by the way, a senior in high school at Island Trees High School when PICO versus Board of Ed was decided. It was the topic of my graduation speech, which I delivered, by the way, without any advance warning to the people who were going to hear it. There was a different, because that's how you had to do that. But I think school boards will be interesting, and you might find breaking news on that, like at every meeting, right? Depending.
Oh,
and-
I mean, for sure. I mean, there's a lot going on even in Plainview right now. There's I mean, honestly, it's any school board. If you watch
54 of them in Nassau County and 70 in Suffolk, right? So that's how many school districts you could possibly be going to, right? So.
well, and and then the mask wearing has just divided people who normally, there would be no division. People who
I
got
think
along. Not.
You might get breaking news on masks, and you're less likely to have, books. Let's put it that way. So,
We'll see.
cool. Terry, what's keeping you busy?
Well, again, as both Pei-Sze and Cecilia said, there's the daily news grind, the daily spot grind that you wake up and you don't know what you're going to do. Stuff that we can do and that we have, I guess, the luxury of doing because we are a public radio station. We're doing a lot on police reform on Long Island. We're doing a lot of environmental work, around all the issues. We just released a podcast last quarter of the year called Higher Ground that looks specifically, that's been turned into also a national radio show on the issues facing Long Island environmentally and how we're going to have to deal with it. And then we have a reporter now that is grant funded that's dedicated to covering veterans issues. So that's important for us, for our Suffolk County audience. So those are the things that we're looking on in depth. Obviously, the police reform stuff, I can't talk too much about it because that involves, as everyone has alluded to, we're trying to break a story, but, those are the things that we're looking at.
And it sounds like based on each of your individual roles, Pei-Sze and Cecilia have to be focused on things that could change several times in a day. David, you may get more time to develop things because of just the frequency with which LIBN produces. And Terry, you may have a little of a mix, right? The luxury of being able to develop some stories with some grant-funded reporters, but still have to deal with the news of the day. One of the panel topics was, when you think about a story that's got to get your attention, and maybe from that unique vantage point, maybe Terry, you could give us some insight into, you could use police reform as an example, or if you can't because it's not yet done, but as a typecast, what was it about that kind of story that interested the radio station in developing a longer term piece on it? Like what's the hook that gets the station interested?
Well, I think as Pei-Sze said, it involves a character or characters. As we say, you need something to hang the story on, because we can have a wonky and wonkish report and talking about different issues, but unless we have people who are actually affected by it or have been affected by it, that's what pulls people's in. That's what pulls the attention. And then we also look to see who's been affected, how many people are affected. Is this really a big issue, or is this someone who is just has an axe to grind that thinks, this is a way to get back at someone? So those are the things that we look at. It's like, it has to be interesting. The best way to make it interesting is if you can have a character that can tell the story.
But there's a pitch that comes your way, in other words. So there was some kind of at least some buzz, or somebody suggested it, or.
Yeah, sometimes it is a pitch, sometimes it is a tip. Sometimes it's the reporter that's going through data that says, hey, I'm seeing this pattern here. One of the stories that we did last month was about forged instruments in Nassau County. And all of a sudden, there was a huge spike in the number of felony arrests among people of color. He got that story by just looking at the data and saying, oh, there's something here. And then he spent the months either attending court on Zoom or showing up in Hempstead, to go through, hearing the cases, talking to the people, and then he had a story.
And you had the luxury of somebody who could do that, who could devote the time, be on site,
Yes.
go where you need to go, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
How is the ability to evaluate that? You had the data. When I hear that a lot in my line of work, you spend a fair amount of time verifying that it's the real data too. So to what extent does there need to be some sort of old school verification that occurs before the data is allowed to drive the story? Are there new methods that you have to use to make sure it's just not from some from a crackpot website, that it's a real source, or Or in your case, was it a public database? So that was easier.
That was, it's public
Yeah.
database.
Okay.
So but I guess generally speaking, it's if someone gives us a tip, it's like, well, who are you? How do you know this? Do you have what evidence or what backup do you have? And then what is your motivation? Are you the good citizen that wants to come forward, or do you have an axe to grind? So again, it's a complicated process. You try to vet it as much as possible, but ultimately it's a gut check.
And we often have to verify data, even if someone says they foiled it and, got this data from an official source, we always have to verify that ourselves. So, we're not just taking information that people provide and running with it, but
Do you have
it does
infrastructure?
help.
Is there infrastructure for that, or do you find yourself having to do that yourself too?
We have help back at the Rock that, there are producers that are dedicated to working with the I team, so we can do that. And even those producers or, other producers who are able to do it will help reporters on a daily basis come up with something. Something that I've needed help with almost, every week is looking at the COVID numbers. If we're doing a story about COVID in schools, it's very hard to read that database on your phone in the car. So, you lean on producers back there to help you sort out the data, present it in a way that's understandable and meaningful.
Great.
It's the same for us too. We have like several reporters who are just data driven. And if you guys remember at the beginning of COVID, remember how crazy it was, how before everything was streamlined, right? The county would put out numbers and the state would subsequently put out numbers or vice versa, and they wouldn't match. And it was so, confusing. And it did get streamlined, but we have one reporter in particular who comes to mind, who is just our data guy. And all day long, he calls for his own numbers. He foils for them. He looks at public data. Like it's a really serious, like tenuous thing to do.
It's the sort on the data too. If I recall correctly, for example, it would look like zip codes on Long Island had a high breakout of COVID because that was the zip code on the driver's license of the college student who was somewhere upstate. Yep. Right. So it's like, where are you? Not just where do you live when you're home. Right. And so I think that probably drove the data analysis to a new level. And by the way, there's been less noise about that lately. So maybe that's been conquered in your view. It's gotten better or easier.
It's
You
still
don't have to say.
No, I was going to say it's still dicey. And the number now that's confusing, or at least that we're finding confusing, is the hospital bed capacity.
Right.
Because there are still different metrics for reporting that. And depending upon what the agenda is, the person who's releasing or the government that's releasing the data, there are discrepancies there.
Right. What's the denominator? Right. Yeah.
And that's what I meant by tenuous. Like, you're getting these numbers, but they weren't always right. It was just, I had a really hard time at the beginning of, this was the beginning of my job at Newsday too. I was new when COVID hit, and I don't remember if they wanted it or if I just wanted it, but every day I was doing the numbers, and then they weren't right, or they were right, but we didn't know which was right, because you're getting this number and this number and this number. And it was, finally I got smart and I'm like, all right, we're not doing exact numbers anymore, but it was difficult. Can I add something to the character-driven news story?
Yeah, it's a panel. Go for it. I'm just.
I think Pei-Sze brought it up first, but there was a story a bunch of us did the other day. News 12, I'll give them credit, they got it first. But it was a woman, a grandma, who had been scammed. Oh, sorry, who was allegedly about to be scammed, but she turned the tables on the scammer. I'm sure you guys saw it. It was great. Talk about a character. This woman was a walking, talking soundbite, and she, even though I didn't break the story, it was News 12's, we had some of the highest numbers, because we obviously Newsday tracks the metrics and stuff. And, with this new Newsday TV endeavor, they really pay attention to what does well, what doesn't. That story did so well, right? And it wasn't brand new. News 12 did have it the night before, but this woman was, not only was she just amazing and she was a good soundbite, but we had the video, we had the Ring doorbell video for that one, similar to Pei-Sze with the vaccine story. But it just made all the difference.
So, maybe on the character front, David, I know in the business community, we spend a lot of time trying not to be newsworthy or to be that, to be more muted and come across as more formal. Do you find that it's less about, is it more about the company than the character when you're developing a story? Is it, what's the hook? Is it it's probably not a flamboyant CEO. It's more likely perhaps a community, a business monument in the community or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, my stories aren't really character driven. They're more driven by data and information. I did want to clarify one point you made earlier, that we have more time to develop stories. We have a website that's runs daily,
right.
and we have to feed that daily. I wrote over 900 byline stories last year, most of which didn't appear in print, but eventually they sometimes do find their way to print. But those are all, a lot of times smaller stories, but deal stories, things that are happening. And sometimes we get, the deal stories turn into bigger stories. So for instance, I'll give you a quick for instance. So everybody probably remembers, or maybe not, when the Dealer Track building was built in North Hills back in 2017, it was a big hoopla about, hey, Dealer Track's coming. They're going to put 800 people here. It's a brand new building. They got over $50 million in economic incentives from the Nassau IDA and also the state. The building's empty. Dealer Track is now looking for space to lease somewhere else on Long Island. And Pro Health, I believe it's Optum is their parent company, has been negotiating to try to take over that building. So the IDA may have to claw back. It would be the biggest clawback in history of the IDA. But those kind of stories come out of my sources with brokers and my conversations I have with brokers, maybe on a smaller deal or this, and they go, hey, did you hear what's going on in Dealer Track? And so, bigger stories like that happen. Also, we broke the story about Geico leaving Woodbury after 20 years. And again, those are from sources from brokers that are working on deals. So the IDA was very interested in that, the Nassau IDA, because they were losing 3,000 jobs to Suffolk County. And they hadn't heard about it until they read our story. So yeah, I mean, it's less character driven, but definitely I have a lot of characters that are brokers, believe me.
Yes.
And you also have to sort through that. You have to know, who's selling your wolf tickets and who's giving you the honest stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if in your line of business in particular, how many clawbacks wouldn't have happened unless you had pointed out that the sort of the IDA business proposition hadn't quite worked out, right? How many, fair question. Right? You should keep track and give yourself credit at the end. So I think that's got potential. I was interested in, so you've all brought up sort of the verification of the source. My own personal story, the diocese had an empty church building a few years ago that was rented out to a congregation that had at one point tried to take the title and own it, which obviously a judge said you can't take the property. At which point the building needed to immediately be landmarked, having no interest prior. And there was a narrative in the news, multiple sources, that the reason it needed to be landmarked was that it was part of the Underground Railroad, which would be a great reason to landmark it. And of course, it would be helpful to have known, and it was easy to tell, that the building was built in 1904, which for those of us who know American history is 40 years after it could possibly have been involved in the Underground Railroad. And it was the first of its kind on the site. It's not like it replaced another one. So, all of the other stuff took over, but the first level reporting would have been, this is not a both sides scenario. They say it was a part of the Underground Railroad, and this group pointed out that it was in 1904. So both sides, right? So it's interesting. At what point did the verification of data matter more? By the way, the town of Hempstead did actually unanimously vote to landmark it. It's a long story. Apparently the shingles were interesting, and all it did was cut the value of the property about in half when we had to sell it. So it's great outcome. But the point being, that's not the reporter's fault, right? Because the town board knew all the facts when they voted anyway. But the data sources just, I think, might continually trouble. One of the other things about data that could be interesting, and I'd be curious about everyone's thoughts on this, and it came in through the chat question, both on this forum and the previous one. To what extent do you think that there's a story to be told, or a story about to break that would, and you could see this being a longer interest piece, certainly a business piece, where a cyber attack is at the base of it? Where do any of you see, hear, or getting action around cyber attacks, whether it's against businesses or, God forbid, it crippled the water system or attack the electric grid, that sort of thing? Have any of you had, and I'll go around and ask, because it seems like the kind of thing that could be breaking news. It could be a developing story, or certainly a business story. So maybe Pei-Sze for starters, but is cyber a thing that's had you get up and have to go somewhere in the morning to cover a breaking story, or do you think it might?
Sure.
Yeah.
No, sure. Cyber attacks on school websites, school files. We've done multiple stories with that. I think it was Rockville Center where it was particularly bad. They hacked, what was it called? It's like crypto lock or something. They basically accessed all their files, held them hostage, and said, you need to pay us, a certain number of Bitcoin for it. But I do think that is going to be one of the bigger stories we're going to be covering in the future. And we saw this I think it was like it was a couple of months ago, maybe last year, but you remember this, when hackers took over the oil pipelines, remember? And there was a huge gas shortage because of that. Like, that is definitely going to be an issue. And there've been books written about this, frankly. What would happen if hackers took over the electric grid? It would cripple the entire region, or the entire country, really. So that is something I think that we should be doing more reporting on, especially, what the government is and is not doing to shore up security at these to protect our natural resources, to protect the electrical grid. But I do think that is something that is going to be very topical.
I think it could be a big break. Let's say it was the electrical grid. You'd find yourself in Greenport or Rockville Center, where they have their own utilities, with the only place with the lights on, that sort of thing. You'd have to hop in a car and go to the right place, right?
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And with water, right? It's Suffolk County Water Authority. In Nassau, there's individual water districts and a couple of for-profits, right? So you could see that being very localized pretty quickly. So, Terry, any cyber in your point of view coming up in your rear view window, or on the horizon, where that's a thing that gets covered? Or?
Well, just like Pei-Sze, there's been the school incidences. I can't remember how many years ago, but it was within the past few years that there was a cyber attack against one of the water utilities in Westchester, if I remember correctly, that, resulted in no damage, but the fact that they did get in. A lot of what we do, though, on cyber would be covered by the network, would be covered by NPR. So we would take more of a local, more of a reactive stance as far as that goes. But no, it's a problem. My son actually writes cyber insurance. So he will tell me if there is something that is going on, that, hey, you should be looking at this. So I do hear from that.
So you could see if there were a national cyber story, and they are from time to time, where you would have to go look for the local reaction based on the sort of the NPR network approach. Would that be something that?
Yeah, local reaction, or if there was something local that really happened that the network was interested in, we would file and do the story for the network.
Sure. Cecilia, anything is that the kind of thing that's rang the alarm in the morning, or do you think it certainly sounds like it would if it were?
I was just looking it up because I haven't personally covered. I mean, I remember Manhasset and Rockville Center, but Newsday's covered it, just not me. But a couple of months ago, one of my colleagues did a whole in-depth look at how many Long Island districts have been hacked from, I believe, 2018 to 2021. And I may have covered it years ago too. There may have been an issue with the BOCES. Guys, not sure if you remember, it's ringing about a few years back, but surely it's an issue. I mean, that's not really something I've covered much, but yeah, I mean, I'm looking at this list in this article, and there are a slew of districts, including Rockville Center, Montauk, Port Jeff, Mineola, Sag Harbor, Lindenhurst, Oyster Bay, the list goes on, who had data breaches or suffered cyber attacks. So it's surely an issue. Yeah. And I mean, forgetting schools for a second, I get, scared these days just with, things I do. I mean, you just hear horror stories all the time. And
Don't click the link. Whatever the link is, don't click it.
I know.
Don't click
Yeah.
it.
Don't click it.
Don't.
I know.
We've had some webinars LIBN has held for businesses about cybersecurity. One of the problems about covering it on our end is, though, you're not going to hear about most of the cyber attacks on individual companies, and there have been many. I've heard rumors that I couldn't substantiate, but several private firms on Long Island have been hit by ransomware attacks specifically, and asked to pay ridiculous amounts of money, to get their things unfrozen and everything. And usually what they do is they wipe their machines and they start fresh, lose a lot of data, but at least they don't have to pay a couple $1 million. But it's a problem, and you just won't hear about it that much. In the public realm, you will, school districts and stuff like that, but you won't hear about it with private companies, and it's happening often.
And if right, you bring up a good point. When you've got public companies that are registered and selling their shares on a stock exchange, they have an obligation to report and regularly evaluate their risk. But the private companies that watch them don't have to say anything. But clearly there are people who would be interested in the dynamic, particularly the other private companies who might want to be, in a heightened state of alert when it happens to them. And you can't sit out, you can't post sentries at corporate offices looking for unmarked cars with Secret Service agents coming to visit to tell you had a cyber attack, right? That doesn't work out practically. That's great. So that's helpful. And that was a question in from the field that I think was a good example of how this sort of an issue that could cross all of the disciplines that are represented here. If there's another question, I've brought it up, from a media relations perspective, the pitch or the tip, right? Tips are obvious. That's an interested citizen, maybe with an agenda, maybe not. When you work with media relations people, where it's a pitch, that's my word. There may be more polite terms for it, but like, what's the type of media relations person that you find best to work with when you're being pitched? Maybe Dave, since you're let's go, Cecilia. Raise your hand.
Sorry.
Raise your hand. You got it.
I don't know that there's a type of person, but I mean, there are people who get it and people who don't. And I think, like, just to give you like a made up example, right? I'm sure the rest of you do too, just so many emails. I don't even have time to read half of them every day. I don't even know how some people find my email address. And, it'll be like, oh, let's say they're opening a new ice cream shop in Rockville Center. Well, my bosses are going to say, okay, that's great. The community might be interested, but that's a free publicity for them. And we're not in the business of doing commercials, right? However, what if the PR person like really dug in and got to know this person? And what if they came from, I'm just making this up, but what if they had a really interesting backstory? Like, maybe they came from Baghdad and had a family chain there, and they had their life savings and they came here. It doesn't have to be an immigrant story. It could be anything. Or what if this was a man who lost his wife and like used their life insurance payment, and this was like the last hope for the family, and I don't know, just some sort of compelling emotional story, right? That is a story. If you just want us to do a ribbon cutting at, a new hardware store, no. But what if you find out that the owner of the new hardware store, his old hardware store burned down, and he like scraped together everything he could, and the community came together and donated money? Like, that's a story. So you got to find that sort of emotional hook that people can either A, relate to, or B, react to. You're muted. Chris, you're muted.
Yeah, some people have said they prefer it when I'm muted, but no, that's great insight. I think it's right, because otherwise it's just another ribbon cutting.
Exactly. And then and you guys will know, like, typically, I mean, Newsday is a little different because we do have like a food section, right? So we will cover a new restaurant. So that's a little separate from the news, right? But for news, like, my bosses are going to say, why are you doing that? That's just a commercial. So you have to be super careful. But if there's a story behind it, well, that's different,
Well, yeah, your boss should know that it was very okay to cover and I covered this on the last panel, that Moroni now has a Southold location where you can get the meatballs and not have to go to Northport. So
I've never been there, by the way. I've been dying to go for years.
it was big news in the Wright household.
Okay.
So, so you never know who you're gonna impact or how. Maybe David, you probably, as you mentioned, it's the brokers whispering and that sort of thing. But are there any pitchmen that pitch people, if you will?
Absolutely.
Come shopping too?
Like Cecilia said, you get to know who's trusted, who's not, who gets it, who doesn't. There's some great PR firms and some great PR people on Long Island that cover the business community, and they're invaluable to us. We have a very small staff, and we have to rely on PR people a lot to help us find stories, and so they're really vital to us. They've become way more important with the shrinking newsrooms. Public relations people have become way more important. And they do understand that, we can't give them a free commercial. So there has to be some kind of news hook. There has to be some relevance to the rest of the business community. But the ones that get it, and most of them do, know that, and they provide us with a lot of help and a lot of great stories. So yeah, I used to, back when I used to write for the New York Times, always looked askance a little bit at PR people. But I've grown to really appreciate them, and they really do help us, with stories.
And you have an interesting dynamic again. If you think about Long Island, right? You took the Long Island Expressway test. A lot of the companies you can see as you drive down the road are public companies, so they've got to follow SEC rules. And so where there's a PR firm pushing for a private company, you might deal with investor relations, where their job is actually to meter and measure and limit what to make sure they don't run afoul of whatever the rules are, right? And so that's got to be an interesting balancing act between, and the more interesting story might be with the public company that can't tell you anything.
Well, that comes into play a lot in my realm, because there might be a deal that's a big sale or something like that, but it has to do with a REIT, a publicly traded REIT that's buying a shopping center or something, and the broker says, I'm on lockdown, I have an NDA, I can't tell you anything. And so then you got to go around and you have to, you get sources that know about the deal. So yeah, that does enter into it a lot.
Although the very fact that they told you they couldn't tell you anything probably told you what you needed to know for the next.
That too.
Right. They confirmed that they have a client and probably the identity. Right. So yeah, always interesting. It's always interesting to watch. I guess Terry, maybe, again, you've got sort of that long-term, you've got the ability to do various lengths and types of studies.
Right, but also, yeah, but I'm going to build on what Cecilia said. I mean, I'm not making this number up. I get 250 emails a day addressed to me. So the first thing that I go through is if you get my name wrong, and I'm not talking about misspelling it, but it's like to my mailbox, but it says Dear Bill, I don't even open that up.
Right.
Number one. And then it's a matter of knowing what I need, knowing what I do. And if you have a specific thing for me, like there are some very good PR people. Jody Fisher, I just saw him pop into the chat. He's someone who knows what he's doing and he knows what I need. So we may not pick up every story that he's pitching, but he gets it. Others will, and I know in the next couple of weeks, I am going to be bombarded with Super Bowl pitches. But if someone says, hey, here's an interesting pitch on a business angle or on a social angle, I might take it. If it's that there's a new flavor of tacos at somebody, I'm not going to go into it. So it's knowing it's knowing what I'm looking for. And it's being respectful of my time. And then the other thing is, because I get so many pitches, don't bury the lead, get it, say it up front. I don't have time to read a 2-page press release to only find out what you're pitching me at the bottom of it.
We'll also say that timing is everything. So today, the whole region is preparing for a snowstorm. I've received several emails from PR people offering to allow us into their store, their client stores to get, people buying shovels, snow melt, groceries. I got an interesting pitch from someone, I won't say their name, but offering a doctor who could talk about injuries that people could sustain while shoveling, the improper way. I may never do a story on that, but on a day like this where I'm looking for angles to talk about snow before it actually snows, I might take them up on it. And it's just, I think it's a very thoughtful way to, target your pitches so that, everyone in my position is looking for something to cover today because there isn't any snow yet. So it's just a pretty smart idea to just send those messages at that moment.
I agree. And I have to say, just because I feel like I don't want it to look as if I were knocking PR people. We're lucky here on Long Island. Like, I mean, I think of one in particular, like Melissa Weir, she used to be at Stony Brook and does hospitals and all these other things. And like, she was always able to find this like great story. Like she would get to know patients and figure it out. But, gosh, we are lucky that we do have a lot of good people out here, but it's so funny. Like my inbox lately, I'm getting pitches from people in other states and they don't know what I cover. And I can't even figure out how they got my name. So it was more of that. But I mean, we have some great, we're lucky here on Long Island that, we have certain PR people, I'm sure Pei-Sze and Terry would agree, where like I need a doctor, right? And I call this one particular hospital and they always get me a doctor within an hour. And that's great. I mean, because with COVID, we need doctors all the time. And then you have people like the Melissa Weirs of the world, or there's this great woman, Donna, who works for Oceanside Schools. And she's always finding these amazing little stories I would never know about and contacting me. So I just want to say, there's of course like a lot of negative, but there are a lot of great local people. But I mean, getting an email from someone from California who obviously, like, if she looked into what I do, I don't cover anything outside of New York, So research your person, like before you pitch them, make sure you're sending it to the right person.
Yeah, by the way, the emails to Newsday, that's a pretty simple reason why you're getting it. It's a fairly predictable.
Well, I know.
Right.
Just, yeah.
First dot last at newsday.com.
Yes, I know.
Not hard to figure out. Yeah.
But
Okay,
still, you're
That
correct.
happens to me too, Cecilia. They'll send me building sales from California, or I cover Nassau and Suffolk. I also get a lot of New York City stuff. I just don't cover it. Cranes is there. They can cover that, or The Real Deal. They can cover that stuff. Talk to me about Nassau and Suffolk. One of my pet peeves, real quick, Chris, is the availability of a PR person after they send you the pitch. Oh, yeah. So a lot of times I'll get a press release and it'll have their phone number. I'll call them, voicemail. I'm like, I need. We have to get stuff on our website. We have 2 news alerts, morning and afternoon. I have to, I have deadlines, and for some reason they send you something and often disappear. So that's really tough. If you send something, be available for questions.
Yeah, that seems like malpractice, to be honest with you. You're going to
happens a lot.
Try to get somebody's interest and then ghost them.
Yeah.
And I agree with David. That's why in my head, I rank some of the best and worst PR people. And I remember there's this woman, she used to work for Charles Schumer. She has her own private firm now. And I was an assignment editor at News 12. And you could call her at 8 in the morning, 7 in the morning, 10 at night. She'd answer her phone. And I have this like list in my head of like the best PR people. And that's it. And there was a woman, Pei-Sze, you probably remember Shelley Lotenberg, right? NUMC.
Oh, yeah.
From Lubick. Yep.
I know Shelley. Yeah.
You guys all know her. You would like page her or call her, and that woman would answer no matter what. And you would need a patient status, you need a status or whatever, and she would get it for you. And I'm like,
well, she's a former reporter, so she really gets it.
Yeah,
exactly.
but she did her, because our jobs aren't always like our jobs are never 9 to 5, and neither is PR. So, yeah.
Great. Well, this is so we're getting close to the top, and I want to make sure that we've answered the questions that came in through the chat. I want to make sure that each of you gets the chance to say something that maybe we didn't cover, that any parting thoughts, and if you can, while you're in those comments, and we'll just go around, maybe talk about how it is you work. And Pei-Sze, you sort of touched on it, right? You've got a diverse set of sources today. How it is that you're working to get more diverse opinions and sources into your stories. seems like you have no lack of them today. People are coming at you with doctors and shovel companies and everything else. So, but
It's interesting. You mean for like other topics, right? If
yeah, or even on a given story to make sure you get all the vantage points. Like, what's the
Well, you look at you try to look at the story globally. I mean, you may only be able to get people willingly to talk to you on one aspect of it, but you sort of take a very global approach on the story, and you identify which angles you might need. You know, a small example of it is the mask mandate, right? It's a legal issue, political issue. I mean, that's what we were covering on Tuesday. I think that's when Monday night the ruling was made. Tuesday is when we dealt with the aftermath. But I thought, you know, well, why don't we hear from a medical professional who could tell us, you know, legal issues aside, politics aside, is this a good time? And so I think, you know, having a a medical expert say, whatever's happening in the courts, you know, I don't care. I think that we should wait 2 more weeks before we lift the mask mandate. Like, you know, just when the numbers get down to at least 5%. To me, that was very clarifying. It's like, okay, well, you know, while this is going on, this is also in the background. And I think that helps reset the issue even, you know, like it actually brings more common sense into the whole story. So I always look for things like that. I mean, you know, also you don't want to hear too much of the echo chamber, as we call it. People pro-mask people saying one thing, anti-mask people saying another. So it just helps sort it out and I think makes the issue much more clear.
it helps you, it avoids the both sides presentation when there's actually some medical professional who could break the tie or something.
Yeah, you know, or it gives you a different perspective, a different way of looking at it. And my hope is that anybody on either side might take a look at it and say, well, you know, I didn't think of it this way, or, you know, unless they're just too convinced about their own position that they wouldn't see that, but you know.
Make it possible, right?
Yeah.
Terry, parting thoughts and anything on diversity? You covered a fair amount of it, so.
Well, I mean, diversity, you know, as Pei-Sze said, you know, we try not to take the both sides because a lot of times there's either more than two sides or the evidence points that could only be one side. You know, it's always a thought of like, who else do we need to speak to, or who else should we speak to? Are we speaking to the same old voices?
Yeah.
Do we need to diversify, you know, demographically who we're speaking to? Are we always speaking to young people? Should we be speaking to older people? Should we be speaking to people of color? So it's a constant struggle. I shouldn't say a struggle, it's a constant challenge, you know, to just say, are we doing right by our audience, that we make sure that all voices are represented?
Great. Cecilia.
I mean, same thing. Obviously, you try to get all sides in the story, but speaking demographically, you know, we're careful at Newsday, you know, Long Island is clearly, we have so many different people of various backgrounds, right? We have a large Hispanic community, we have a Black community, we have a Haitian community in Elmont, we have, you know, Italian Americans, you know, so you know, I'm very, you know, aware of like when I go to get, and I hate the term man on the street, MOS, but I don't want to be saying POS.
Right, the acronyms start to fail you.
Yeah, so good exactly. But no, I'm very aware that when we go, it sounds terrible. I hope I don't get in trouble for that. But
That's
when
fine.
we go out to get, you know, man on the street, that we're not just getting like, let's say all you know, white men in their 60s or something. I try to get a younger person. I try to get maybe you know, a Hispanic woman, an Indian woman, and you know, you just try to get a mix of people. And that's something that, you know, we're very careful about with Newsday. But when it comes to the stories, I mean, and to Pei-She's point, I did a similar thing. I did gosh, was it yesterday? Oh, sorry, it's 2 days ago. There was a big like kind of anti-mask rally, or they might say pro-choice rally when it comes to wearing masks in Hauppauge. So to counter it, got a medical expert. But the medical expert actually was interesting because he's always been like, everyone should wear a mask, but he actually brought up, he kind of evolved a little bit and said, well, you know, maybe if kids are vaccinated, they don't have to wear a mask in school, but maybe they could sit somewhere else. So it was kind of funny because I thought he would be different than he was, but like you also can't, my point is you can't force the narrative. You can do the best you can. You can try to get, each side, and Pei-Sze will attest to this, and Terry and David, all of us, is that you also only have like such a small time frame, and you do the best you can every day to get as many voices in as you can by deadline. And hopefully it works. We do our best every day, and that's the hard part of it, being a
And
day later.
today's diversity story will be, when you cover plowing, make sure you know whether they're talking about state, county, town, or village roads.
Oh, don't
Yeah.
get started.
Right. And David, you get the parting thoughts, and then I think Jackie's going to wrap us up. So
Yeah, just real quick. So we have a particular audience because we're business to business. So a lot of times we don't want to include, we don't want to do both sides, or we don't want to include a certain type of opinion or advocacy in a piece. And I'll just give you a real quick example. I did a story about on opt-out fallout. And I interviewed, and this was about the cannabis stores. Almost every municipality on Long Island opted out of having marijuana or cannabis stores in their town. There's only a few that accepted it. And so we focused on the entrepreneurs that were hoping to open these businesses. And there was a whole social equity part of the law. And we concentrated on those type of people that were now being shut out of business opportunities. So it wasn't like we were trying to, keep certain people out of the story, but the story wasn't about relitigating whether cannabis should be legal or not, because people have it's a very emotional issue and people have opinions on that. It was about the business aspect and what's this going to do to business, because they were hoping for a whole bunch of money to come out of it, and now it's going to be severely limited because of the parochial attitudes of a lot of the municipalities.
with all the upside going to the Shinnecock Nation.
Well,
Right.
and
Right.
some other places.
Right, exactly, yeah. Well, great. Well, this has been a great panel. I thank you for indulging my questions as a non-practitioner of your craft. I think it was good interaction. I appreciate everybody finding time today in a breaking news day to work with our audience. I appreciate their questions and their engagement as well. Jackie, if you have any parting thoughts, feel free.
Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks to you for moderating and doing all the heavy lifting this morning. I do want to thank everyone. I know it seems like all you're doing is talking shop, but when you're actually talking to news consumers, you're doing a real public service by taking them behind the scenes, letting them see, what you deal with on a daily basis, and letting them see that you're good people trying to do your best every day, right? And that's the best anyone could ever ask of anyone.